My Lords, I believe that there were two questions from this morning that I ought to come back on. The first was a question, I think, from my Lord Justice Arnold about whether Professor Lozano's written evidence of obviousness considered alternatives other than LCGs. And if we take up bundle, the supplemental bundle, tab 8, page 117, that's where at paragraph 211, well, 210 to 211, Professor Lozano is considering what you would do once you'd verified that not all the desired properties are met. And he says that a skilled person would look for the random number generator in the literature, for instance, by turning to a standard reference text. Then he explains what they would be. And then he talks about the fact that one of the oldest and best known random number generators is the LCG. So, whilst it is right that he specifically refers there to LCGs, he does take the step, first of all, of saying that you would look for a random number generator. But then, when having done that...
What he doesn't do, and you'll correct me if I've misunderstood, he doesn't say the skilled person would see that not all the desirable properties are met. Faced with that problem, they would consider the following options: 1, random number generator; 2, hashing function; 3, whatever.
I accept that, but
he goes straight to the random number generator without any consideration of any alternatives.
Yes, and that is because, obviously, of his evidence at paragraph 206, which is that he would see that Ericsson is using KX plus L to generate a random number. So he sees, and obviously he wants to keep mod C. And we've discussed that paragraph already, but it's because he sees KX plus L as generating a random number, or attempting badly to generate a random number. So he wants to improve that. And we've discussed all of that already.
Okay.
And then the second point was whether it was put to Professor Lozano that you would implement NRC3's random number generator. And we believe that the answer to that is no. It wasn't put to Professor Lozano that what you would do once you were NRC3 was not turn up Knuth, but stay with NRC3 and use the belts and braces, or whatever it was called, random number generator. And so that wasn't put in cross-examination, it wasn't running closing, and presumably that's why there isn't any appeal on the point that you would go to Knuth. So we're still on NRC3 now, and I was going through various paragraphs of the judgment that we say are relevant to contextualise the judge's findings. And another point that I want to refer, my lords, to is paragraphs 248 to 249, which is on page 112 of the judgment. And that is the judge's findings that it was clear from Professor Lozano's evidence, accepted by Ms. Dwyer and also supported by NRC and Knuth and Wikipedia, that LCGs were very well known, had a long history and were fast and easy to understand and implement. And then a similar point is made in 2494. And so that is also part of the context in which the skilled person is reading NRC 3. And
can I be sure I understand that? The statement that LCGs were very well known is not a statement that they were very well known to a skilled person, because it's accepted that it's not CGK for a skilled person to know about LCGs.
That's right, but...
So in what sense is it part of the context that the skilled person who ex hypothesi is not familiar with LCGs, that it's part of a context that they're very well known? What does that...
Well, because...
What does that mean in practice?
I mean, what it means is that the skilled person has either looked at Wikipedia or they've looked at NRC3 plus Knuth because
Yep.
the skilled person has gone to Knuth. And based on those things, either Wikipedia or Knuth, you know that LCGs are very well known, have a long history, and were fast and easy to understand and implement. And
I see.
as it says at paragraph 2494, the theory behind them was easy to understand.
So is this the point you're making, Ms. Lane, that someone who's never heard of LCGs has now heard of them and now discovers that in their context they're very well known, and that's relevant because obviously if you're implementing something, then you're more likely to implement something if you found out that other people think it's very well used.
Yes, you're more likely to use it if it's well known, it's got a long history, and it's fast and easy to understand and implement. I mean, it's not one of these ones, I think, a bit like in NRC3 that's got, you know, many complicated functions and code. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And obviously, as we'll come on to see, you just need a random number generator that is good enough for a not particularly demanding application. And of course, we also say that NRC3 itself tells the reader that your choice of random number generator all depends on the application. And so we rely on the first part of NRC3, which is outlined at paragraph 241 of the judgment, where it says the pragmatic point of view is thus that randomness is in the eye of the beholder. What is random enough for one application may not be random enough for another. And then there's the reference at the bottom of that page, the good random number generators ought to pass all of these tests, or at least the user had better be aware of any that they fail, so that he or she will be able to judge whether they are relevant to the case in hand. So in our submission, NRC3 is making the point itself, which is the point that the judge also makes in the judgment, which is how random they have to be all depends on the application. Now we then move on to the part of the judgment which is challenged, as I understand it, and that's paragraphs 252 to 257. And we can see why it is that the judge found that although initially very striking, the statements in NRC are of low relevance at most to the issue of obviousness in the case. And that was based on a number of points. First of all, it was obviously based on the expert evidence, and that in particular was Professor Lozano's evidence, which was that what was under consideration in NRC is demanding situations where very long sequences of random numbers are needed. So this is die hard. And that was way beyond what anyone at RAN 1 would even think about. At RAN 1, we've never seen sequences of more than a few thousand or maybe tens of thousands of repetition of period. And he said that the more sophisticated RNGs in NRC were way beyond anything that is required in a mobile device. And so that was the expert evidence on the point.
Did you give us a reference for that?
I might have to ask my learned junior to find that. Sorry, I don't have it at my fingertips at the moment. It's in the cross-examination. It might be...
I wasn't asked to be told. Could you just give me the reference or something?
Yes, Supplemental Bundle 13, page 153. I mean, I was going to turn that up at some point, so shall I turn it up now? That might be convenient to do that right now, as we're talking about it. So, Supplemental Bundle, tab 13, 153. And we've got, first of all, on page 100 from line 20 is the question about die hard. And in answer on page 101 at the top, Professor Lozano says it's a test for randomness, but we're talking about extreme randomness here. And cryptography, for instance, requires sequences that are longer than the edge of the universe measured in seconds. And this is way beyond what anyone at RAN 1 would even think about. At RAN 1, we've never seen sequences of more than a few thousand, or maybe tens of thousands of repetitions. And then at page 102, there's more evidence from lines 11 to 19. I mean, like I say, my lord, the requirements that are being put here are extreme, way beyond anything that's required in a mobile device. So what was being sought for solutions that got the job done and were as simple as possible. So that was the evidence of Professor Lozano, paragraph 252. We then had paragraph 253, which I've already referred my lords to, but that's the secondary evidence. And paragraph 254 is important as well, because I think at one stage yesterday there was a question from my lords about how is it that you know that what you're doing doesn't require a very demanding random number generator. And it's because the skilled person would know that there are about 65,000 UEIDs, I'm reading from paragraph 254 of the judgment now, that needed to be distributed randomly, and that was vastly lower than the scales relevant to cryptography. So it was suggested by my learned friend that the skilled person wouldn't know that the application was not demanding, and that's simply not right. They know because they know the scope of the problem that they're dealing with, 65,000 roughly UEIDs, and they're only in the end going to be distributed over 10 subframes.
I thought the point that was being made against you was that when you read NRC 3, it doesn't say never use an LCG unless you're only dealing with a few tens of thousands numbers. It just says never use. And you don't get from the passage we were shown in 7.1 an exception for undemanding applications. And so it's not obvious where that comes from. And again, as I understood it, Mr. Abrahams built on the fact that the skilled person doesn't know about LCGs before he goes to the literature, goes to NRC 3, and the first thing he sees is don't ever use LCGs. So how does he get from that? You can use LCGs in undemanding situations. That was, I thought, the point that was being made.
Yes, I mean, that was one of the points being made, and it's all based on my learned friend's inappropriate dumbing down of the skilled person. I mean, my learned friend is reading NRC 3 as though it is just a book in English, which you don't need to have any technical background to understand, and you're reading it completely out of context, not in the context of the specific problem that you're actually trying to solve. And what we say is the skilled person is much more skilled than my learned friend says, because whilst they haven't heard of LCGs, initially anyway, it's not part of their CGK, they are people who can handle random number generators. They are comfortable with random number generators, and they have sufficient skills to implement them, findings which, as I pointed out, are not challenged. And as I've also already mentioned, and I want to come back to this, paragraph 257 of the judgment is important because this is the paragraph where the judge is going back to the point on the law that he's already referred to about lions in the path, and saying that the skilled person would think that these were adequate for appropriately chosen tasks, and would hold that the patent does not change the perception one way or another. It contains a modest and rather poorly documented body of work showing that the use of an LCG gave acceptable results in a non-demanding context. So for that reason, it's simply not open to Optis to say that the skilled person wouldn't understand that. And it's not possible for the patentee in this case to rely on what my learned friend tried to rely on and say, oh, well, we know that these things all work now because I can download films on my mobile phone. I mean, that's not something that is in the patent. doesn't form part of the teaching of the patent that this works in practice on mobile phones.
Sorry, Ms. Lane, I understand that, but I don't. Well, unless I missed it, and apologies, I don't feel that I've heard an answer to what I thought the point of my lord's question was. If you start from the premise that LCGs are not common general knowledge,
Yes,
and that Knuth isn't the starting point,
yes,
then if it's true that the text of NRC, as a matter of words, says use LCGs in any context, what's the source for which an expert witness can rely to justify the conclusion that the skilled reader would not accept that and would think that you could use LCGs in another context? Because they've never heard of LCGs. It's not part of their common general knowledge.
well, my lord has
I know
started.
the expert said it, and I understand that you're entitled to say, well, the expert said it, but I'm not understanding on what basis. And what I'm worrying about is whether what's happened is that the expert's own premise was a premise which, in fact, the judge had rejected. For example, that you might start from Knuth, or that LCGs were common general knowledge from his point of view, and that's infected the way this has gone.
Well, my lord, I'm not sure that was how the evidence came about. But more importantly, my lord started from one of the premises of that question was Knuth is not common general knowledge, and that's correct. But there is a finding, not challenged on this appeal, that the skilled person would go to Knuth. They would find their way to Knuth one way or the other. Right. So they're not reading NRC3 in isolation without the information in Knuth.
Yeah, but NRC3 says don't trust anything earlier than 1995.
No, Knuth is 1997 though.
Well, accepted that it's not. There
well,
we go.
My lord, that was not a point that was taken at trial.
I understand that.
So the cross-reference is to a 1997 text. So the reader is not going to look at that and think, I won't look at it because it's out of date. And the only evidence there was that the main parts of the chapter were the same. And it was up to Optis, if it wanted to say something different, to put that evidence in. I mean, it only brought in NRC3 in the cross-examination bundle. And as I've said, it did not run the point that you wouldn't go to, it definitely didn't run the point that you would just implement NRC3's RNG.
But what did Professor Lozano say was the reason why, even despite NRC, you would still think that LCGs could be used in low demanding situations?
Well, because they were well known and easy to implement, and therefore good enough for the undemanding situation. I mean, the reason that NRC3 is criticising them is because it's talking about random number generators that have much longer periods than ones that were needed in this case. It's talking about much more sophisticated random number generators.
Can I ask you, the reference you showed us in 252 to Die Hard, and you showed us to where that's dealt with in the cross-examination.
Yes.
Looking at the cross-examination, that seems to be a bit of NRC3 we've not got, which is 7.1.7. And what the professor is clearly dealing with there is very long, the 10 to the 30 or 10 to the 40 sequences. And no doubt, entirely correctly, he says, well, that's what you need for cryptography. You don't need anything like as long as that. But the bit we were shown of NRC3 says never use anything less than 10 to the 19. And that's obviously much less demanding than the 10 to the 30 or 10 to the 40 cryptographic sequences. And I just wonder whether what is said in 252, which is there are some very demanding applications which have to pass very demanding tests with very long sequences, whether explaining that actually leads to what seems to be what the judge takes from it, which is that in less demanding situations you can use LRGs and LCGs, but I don't see that in the bit of NRC3 that we were shown.
Well, I mean, there is another bit at paragraph 243, which talks about never use a generator with a period of less than 2 times 10 to the 19. But that in itself is much, much longer than the period you need in this case, because you're only talking about 65535.
How do you know that if you're a skilled person? How do you don't know about LCGs? You go and look at NRC3 because you want a random number generator. And you see all the health warnings that are there, and we're being invited. Rather, the judge was being invited to read the health warnings as not applicable in certain circumstances. And how do you, as a skilled person without experience of LCGs, know that the health warnings aren't applicable?
Well, my lord, there's also, as I think I pointed out previously, paragraph 254, which is the skill of the judgment, which is the skilled person would know that there are about 65,000 UEIDs. So the point is, you're not in a situation where you need this huge number.
No, you don't need 10 to the 30 or 10 to the 40.
No, but you also don't even need 10 to the 19. That's my point.
But you need to know how LCGs work in order to know that actually, for this sort of application, LCGs are fine, despite what NRC3 appears on its face to say, which is they should never use them. And that's...
Well, you've also... sorry.
No, sorry.
I mean, you've also got Knuth, and you've got the fact that they've been used. They had a long history. They were well known. They're fast and easy to understand and implement. And when you turn to Knuth, which is the Bible, it's the main reference work, what do you see? The first random number generator that is dealt with is LCGs, and they're dealt with at great length.
Well, indeed, and I understand why you rely upon that, but this long used point troubles me, because NRC3 says, yes, LCGs have long been used. It refers to the field's long preoccupation with them. And says, well, it was misguided. So NRC3 starts from the premise that this is a long established technique and says, well, we now know it's wrong.
But you have got to remember that your skilled person is looking at it in the context of the specific application. And so in this specific application, you don't need anything that is that complicated. And in fact, it's going to cause you problems potentially, because then it's going to be much more complex. It's going to be much harder to implement. It's going to take up much more memory.
Yeah, well, I understand that, but I think what we're asking you to do is to identify us if you can do so. And it may be that there's no answer to this question. You can rely upon the fact that your witness gave evidence which was accepted by the judge, that in this context, LCGs were good enough. And that was clearly his opinion, and that was what the judge accepted. But what we're asking is, was there anything objective in the material that supported the professor's opinion, or was it just that that was his opinion?
Well, I'm not sure whether my lord is asking about specifically within NRC3 or outside
Yes,
that.
specifically within NRC3.
Well, I mean, I've pointed out the bit at 241, which is it's all about what's in the eye of the beholder and the programme.
Of what?
Sorry, paragraph 241, I'm just taking it from the judgment. But it's NRC3. What's random enough for one application may not be random enough for another. And this is the bottom, good random number generators ought to pass all of these tests, or at least the user had better be aware of any they failed, so that he or she will be able to judge whether they're relevant to the case in hand. There's the signpost to Knuth. There's also at paragraph 243, in the second lot of bullet points, you may also want to watch for indications that a generator is over-engineered and therefore wasteful of resources. So you don't want them to be over-engineered.
Yes, but the examples given in that are miles away from where we are. 24 arithmetic operations, serious cryptographic use,
Yes.
period of more than 10,
Yes.
10 to 100.
Yes. But well, I think I've made all my points already. You've got the surrounding documentation, including in particular Knuth, and you've got the expert evidence on this topic. And of course, we know, because this is another finding as part of the CGK, that the skilled person can conduct simulations. So they can give it a whirl effectively. My Lord, I think I've picked up most of the points that Optis make about this, but I just want to pick up on one point that I've probably not addressed yet, which is that Optis complains that Professor Lozano's evidence suffered from hindsight because he referred to NRC2. And obviously, my Lords will appreciate that the judge had specifically addressed at paragraph 238 of the judgment the criticism that Professor Lozano only found the second edition of NRC. Therefore he was obviously clearly aware that was the route by which Professor Lozano had gone. And you'll recall also that the judge had specifically considered whether Professor Lozano was affected by hindsight in relation to Knuth, and explicitly said that his approach to Ericsson was appropriate. And that was at paragraph 21, which I think I took my Lords to this morning. So I'm not saying that's a specific finding about NRC2, but what I'm pointing out is that the judge clearly had hindsight well in mind. There's also something rather bizarre about saying that an earlier text can inject hindsight, and so we don't really understand how this is or why this is expressed as a hindsight point. So, my Lords, I was planning next to move on to the specified claims, unless my Lords have any further questions on the unspecified claims.
No, thank you.
So, Optis argues, in addition to what I think is its main point now on the modulus, it really argues two additional points, which again we don't think are in its grounds in relation to the specified claims. But first is that the skilled person would have no knowledge, understanding or experience of LCGs, and so would be entirely dependent on the teaching in Knuth. And then that due to their lack of skill, the skilled person would simply choose the simple virtuous generator in section 3.6 of Knuth. And we say that those points are contrary to findings in the judgment, which I've already gone to, and I don't think I need to again, but I went through them this morning in relation to the skilled person. So it was paragraphs 36 to 38, where the judge found that the skilled person would be comfortable with random number generators. There's also a finding that the patent assumes that the skilled person would be able to find more parameters at that part of the judgment. The judge rejected, as my Lords will recall, at paragraphs 112 to 117, the argument that the skilled person could only use off-the-shelf solutions. And also, there is the part of the judgment on insufficiency that I've already referred my Lords to at paragraphs 335 to 337 that we looked at this morning, that makes clear that the skilled person has a greater degree of skill than Optis suggests. I'd also remind my lords that Ms Dwyer had not even suggested herself that the skilled person would use the simple virtuous generator in Knuth. And that was a point that the judge recorded at paragraph 176 of his judgment. So 176, that's on page 100 of the bundle. When Ms Dwyer introduced the rest of the chapter, this is the rest of Knuth chapter 3, she did so for the limited purpose of highlighting section 3.4.1 on generating small random numbers, but the main purpose for which the rest of the chapter was used at trial by Optis was to highlight the summary section to which Ms Dwyer had not drawn attention. So I mean, this was a lawyer's point essentially. Now, Optis, as I understand it, restricts its case on the modulus, which is what we need to turn to now, to saying that the judge erred in accepting Professor Lozano's evidence that the skilled person would ignore the guidance in Knuth that the modulus should be rather large. And this is dealt with in the judgment at paragraphs 302 to 314. And so that starts at the bottom of page 121 and goes all the way over to 2/3 of the way down 123. And we say that it was all based on, essentially, on Professor Lozano's evidence and indeed also on Ms Dwyer's evidence. And I was going to take my lords to the evidence references on that to make that point good. So we start with Professor Lozano's written evidence, which is at tab 8 of the supplemental bundle, page 117. And it's at the bottom of page 117, paragraph 216, where he talks about the skilled person turning to choose the values of the parameters. And he's talking about choosing the modulus here in paragraph 216. So if I could ask my lords to just read that.
It's a little curious. He says the skilled person would inevitably arrive at 65537, and in almost the same breath says that other suitable prime numbers are 131071 and 524287. Seems odd to say that you inevitably arrive at one result and then go on straight away to say that there are at least two other suitable results.
My learned junior reminds me that he did say in cross-examination that he misspoke there, that it wasn't inevitable.
Right, thank you.
I'm afraid we don't have the transcript reference.
I'll take that for you, thank you.
As I understand it, his rationale for saying that 65537, having got that far, is a well, I'm using my own words to say good candidate. I don't know how he put it. Because it's the smallest one.
Yes, and it's in the table.
And it's in the table.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, it's the smallest one over 65535, which is 2 to the n plus or minus 1, and prime. And it's in the table.
Does it? The smallest one bigger than 65536, I think. For what it's
yes, yes.
Does it make any real difference to the speed of calculation whether you use a 5-digit number or a 6-digit number? I can see that if you have to do 24 different calculations every millisecond, that's different from doing 2, but
I think there was some evidence on that, and I don't know what it said, so my learned junior is going to look for it.
thank you.
Oh, my instructing solicitor says it makes a big difference whether it's 16 bits or 17 bits, but I mean, we're now paraphrasing, so let's find that.
It is 17 bits.
But it is 17.
Oh, okay.
There's more
Fine.
than 2
We'll-
to the
we'll-
16.
My instructing solicitor tells me there's a trick that can do it in 16 bits, but I think now I'm falling into my learned friend's trap of giving expert evidence. So I'll try not to, and I'll wait till we get the transcript references. So just looking at the cross-examination, because I think this does go to the specific point raised about whether what Knuth says that it has to be rather large is problematic. And it's in tab 14, and it starts at page 164, and in particular at the bottom, first of all, of page 245, starting around line 18, and this is just talking through Knuth, and if I could ask my lords just to read to down first of all to line 16 on page 246. So that's just the explanation in oral evidence of what you've just seen in written evidence. And then there's some further explanation on page 247, really all of 247. And then over the page 248, the sort of first half of 248 and the first half of 249 is just more explanation of applying the teaching of Knuth. And then I think the meat of the matter about the period length is really 252, where he's talking about, or asked the question about two reasons he gave. The first is to maximise the period length. And my learned friend says, well, why are you concerned about that? Because you only need 10 numbers. And so this is where he explains on 252 between lines 13 and 20 why you want to have more than 65536. But past that point, it's pointless to make it bigger. And there's a little bit more relevant cross-examination as well, which is over the page on page 167 of the bundle, 257 of the transcript, starting at line 18. Which is really about the bigger the modulus, the longer the period. There's a point at which it will cost you more computational effort for no clear benefit. And if you are worried about whether 65537 is any good, you can test it using simulations. So the skilled person has a reason for choosing a number bigger than 65535, which is you want to have that number of random numbers. They have a reason for not making it much bigger than that because you want it there to be ease of computation and there's no clear benefit, and in any event you can test it using simulations. And for what it's worth, Ms. Dwyer's evidence, I won't take my lords to the transcript, but it's in the judgment at paragraphs 313 to 314 on page 123. And the judge found that effectively that was generally supportive of Professor Lozano's evidence. And the point of the main point now taken on appeal, which is, well, you should have had a much larger modulus, that would have been the thing to do. It is dealt with explicitly by the judge at paragraph 310, and he there records the fact that Professor Lozano was pressed hardest on that proposition, and he was firm in the context of LTE. There was no point generating far more numbers than were needed. It would add to the calculation load to do so. I accept this, and it gels with my findings on the CGK that the amount of randomness needed must depend on the application. And the skilled person would think that 65537 was very likely to be adequate and would know that it could assess its suitability with calculations or simulations. And so we say that there is no reason for going behind that finding of the judge that was properly based on the expert evidence of the width of the experts. So, my lords, I'm now going to go to the step-by-step point, because as I understand it, the point on the multiplier which was taken is now only used, or a certain point relating to max hits is just used or attempted to be used by my learned friend in the context of the step-by-step attack. And my learned friend had, I think, 4 points on the step-by-step attack. He had, first of all, the point about max hits and the multiplier A. And that was a point, he said, where Professor Lozano, there was hindsight in his evidence, he said, and we've seen the cross-examination where my learned friend suggested to Professor Lozano that he'd only mentioned the point because of the patent, but he didn't agree with that. And of course, now that there is no attack on the judge's finding in relation to this, we know that the judge's finding at paragraph 317 is that the thrust of Professor Lozano's evidence was that simulations generally would yield adequate values for the multiplier. And so, I mean, this isn't even a step anymore, in a sense, because it's accepted that it would be an obvious thing to do, to use simulations, and that you would find a suitable metric. So I don't see how that can assist Optis on the step-by-step argument, and that's before we get to the numerous passages of the judgment where the judge considered the step-by-step issue. The second point my learned friend relied on was he said that you only got to the literature search after making some fundamental decisions. So you've decided that you're happy with mod C and that you're going to look for a random number generator. And obviously I've covered those general points anyway, But as I think my Lord Justice Arnold said yesterday, you're not going to do a literature search in a void. I mean, that just isn't an efficient way for a highly skilled person to proceed. They're going to make a decision about the route that they want to try first, and they're going to want to limit their search in some way. And so that, again, we say doesn't support the idea that there is some step-by-step approach here that is inappropriate. Thirdly, my learned friend relied on the judge's treatment of alternative options, and again, we say there was nothing wrong with that, because the judge did look at the possibility of alternative options and assessed those very clearly as part of his overall assessment, and considered whether or not the route that Professor Lozano said would be a sensible one and the likely one that the skilled person would take, whether that could be criticised because there were other alternative options. And of course, the judge found that it would be the most natural way forward, and certainly one of the leading ones, at paragraph 231. By way of his fourth reason, my learned friend said that there were no reasons in Professor Lozano's evidence for keeping the mod C part of the Ericsson function. And we say that is simply not the case. That, I think we've already looked at this actually, but if one turns up Professor Lozano's first report at paragraph 206, which is bundle tab, supplemental bundle tab 8, page 116, the skilled person would recognise that Ericsson was using mod C to get a number between 0 and C minus 1, and would consider that the obvious and natural way to achieve that end. And he explained in cross-examination why he considered it the obvious and natural way, and it was because that was what was done in RAN 1. And as I've already mentioned, the judge can hardly be said to have not been aware of the step-by-step point. He did refer to it a number of times and clearly had it well in mind. So in particular in the judgment at paragraphs 96, oh, sorry, that's a wrong reference. So 192 is the section where he considers technograph and number of steps, and the fact that Optis emphasised that, and talks about the 19-step document produced at trial, and made clear that it, you can count steps in different ways. But in particular at 196, what is important overall is for the court to be sensitive to whether the gap between the prior art and the patent is being deconstructed in such a way as to build in hindsight. And I've borne this in mind. And again, at paragraph 207, he says that Optis split this down into many more steps. As I've already said, I do not intend to go through them one at a time, but I've borne them in mind. Then at paragraphs 294 to 296, at paragraph 294, as I've already mentioned, this is where he seems to set out a number of steps which he thought had to be taken on Apple's case. And he says at paragraphs 296, I've borne very much in mind that Apple's case involves a number of sequential steps, but I find that they represent systematic, uninventive work and not the use of inappropriate hindsight. I note in passing that my learned friend seems to have dropped his point, which turns on the meaning of they in this paragraph, or at least it hasn't featured in oral arguments, so I won't address it. I mean, he was clearly looking at the overall number of steps there. And then finally, he also referred to the point at paragraph 321, in relation to the specified claims, although I've had to explain this is on page 124, although I've had to explain my reasoning in a sequence of steps, I'm satisfied that there's no improper salami slicing. Each step flows into the next for logical and routine reasons. The choices are related in ways which support their combination being obvious. This is basically careful implementation work of the kind which the notional skilled person is inherently well equipped. And this was part of the case where I thought Professor Lozano's advantage over Ms. Dwyer, he's talking about the specified claims here, was particularly striking. So that was the judge's consideration, and it's a pretty surprising contention that an experienced patent judge who mentioned on a number of occasions that he was considering the step-by-step approach should be said to have failed to do so properly when there isn't anything really being relied upon to demonstrate that. I mean, there are a number of individual points, but those individual points are ones that we've addressed already. I think it's also worth going to the Technograph case, which my learned friend, I think, put in the bundle yesterday. It's probably right at the back of my Lord's Authorities bundles. I don't know if it's, perhaps we've left it loose. I'm sure it's well known, but just step through it quickly. First of all, by looking at the head note. So the plaintiffs brought an action for infringement of their patent. That's the first line of the head note. And starting at line 21, the defendant challenged the validity of the patent on inter alia the ground of obviousness and relied on a prior United States patent for making electrostatic shields. Then starting at line 26, the defendants called no expert evidence as to the similarities or differences in function between the conductive parts of an electrostatic shield of the kind described and the printed circuit components with which the plaintiff's patent was concerned. The only expert witness who was called by the plaintiffs deposed that he would have gained no assistance from the US specification in solving the problem of eliminating point-to-point wiring in radio and television sets.
The thing about Technograph, which I don't understand, is given on that summary of the expert evidence, why is Lord Diplock talking about step-by-step evidence?
Well, we'll come to that in a minute.
Okay.
But it was because that was the way that the expert was cross-examined, but without the cross-examiner having any of his own expert evidence to support that. So, see over the page at line 5, the trial judge upheld the validity of the patent. And dismissing the appeal, this is the holding at line 10, the plaintiff's invention was not obvious, and then it says per Lords Reed and Morris, I actually think possibly it's also per Lord Diplock, but anyway, whether or not it was obvious to take a particular step was a question of fact, which was formally left to the jury. The question was whether at the relevant date it would have been obvious to the unimaginative, skilled technician what he must be supposed to have done was to have tried everything which would have appeared to him as giving any prospect of valuable results. On this matter, the evidence of experts was generally valuable and often necessary. And then, I mean, I won't go through the judgments of all the judges, but certainly Lords Reed and Lord Morris made very clear that expert evidence was important. But if we turn now to Lord Diplock, since that's the judgment in which we find the relevant step-by-step point, at paragraph 360, page 360, about a third of the way down the page, line 14, the only issues in this appeal are, was the invention obvious, and if not, did the appellants infringe it? And then if I could ask my lords to just read from line 23 over the page to line 3, please. So it's a case in which they'd been looking for a solution to the problem for a long time and hadn't found one. And it's a case in which at the trial there was no expert evidence, and so there was no expert evidence called by the defendant who was challenging validity, and so their counsel alone was making bricks with sparse straws. My lords, we say there's definitely an analogy here with that. And then going over the page now to page 362, one can see again there's quite a long passage from lines 5 to 30 which deal with the fact that there was no expert evidence called by the appellants. That's on line 11. And then it records that the only expert witness, this is at line 17, deposed that he would have gained no assistance from O'Connell's specification in solving the problem. And then at lines 32 to 33, in the absence of any such material, I do not think that your lordships are entitled in so technical a field to reject this uncontradicted expert evidence. So again, we say that that's an important point in this case. And we then get the passage about the familiar step-by-step course. And Lord Diplock says, I do not find it persuasive. But that, of course, was because it wasn't based on any expert evidence. And he therefore ultimately dismissed the appeal. So we say that actually this is a case not so much, or not relevant so much in this case for what it says about step by step, which, as I've already mentioned, the judge clearly had in mind and properly cited and considered, but because it makes it very clear that expert evidence plays a very central role in such cases, and certainly, at least on appeal, it's very important not to simply go behind expert evidence which hasn't effectively been supported by any other alternative expert evidence. And we say also, of course, in relation to the steps, that our steps are not only possible to postulate in light of the invention. It's not a case where you can only come up with the steps once you know what the invention is. On the contrary, Ericsson itself tells the skilled reader to verify that it has the desired properties. There are only two parts to that function. If you're to consider it in parts, and it's clear that one part, the mod C part, is okay. If you're looking then to change the other part, then a literature search would throw up LCGs as the best known option for random number generators. And of course, remember that the inventor himself said it was nothing new really. And so once the LCG has been chosen to replace the random generator part, then the skilled person needs to select parameters, and they can do that following the teaching of the Bible of Knuth. And so we say there is no good basis for overturning the judge's judgment. Of course, my lords know well and have already had it repeated ad nauseam what the test is. It's not good enough to think, well, I might at trial have come to a different view if I had been the trial judge. It's got to be obviously looked at with a great deal of care, and insofar as these are findings of fact, which many of them are, it's got to be a finding which was rationally insupportable, and insofar as it's the overall evaluative exercise, then my lords would have to be satisfied that the judge's conclusion is outside the bounds within which reasonable disagreement is possible. And given the expert evidence in that case, that is simply not a conclusion that my lords can safely reach on appeal, when we've obviously had to engage to a great extent in island hopping. My lords, is there anything else I can assist with?
Actually, maybe the same question actually. I'm puzzled by the point that my lord made about Ericsson and C16 and the problem with why it also is a problem whether C is 8 or 4 or 2. Because when you start thinking about that, if it is just as much of a problem as C is 8 or 16 or 2, one is left with the impression that that equation can't possibly work, and that would have been perfectly obvious. You wouldn't have needed to do a test on it, but that's clearly not the evidence. The evidence seems to be that yes, there is a problem with C16 if you think about it, but you have to think about it, and you'll find out. You do simulations and everything else. But so I'm struggling to understand, and it may not matter very much, but it's bugging me.
Okay, my lord, can I just briefly say something to my learned Juliet, because I meant to ask him a question this morning, which I forgot. Okay, it is right that it goes that it is a problem with those other numbers. I think my lord's question was, why did no one notice that? I mean, they noticed.
Well, that is relevant. That's part of what's behind this, because of course, what it's perhaps an illustration of is the pernicious nature of hindsight. Because it's all very well. It doesn't sound like anybody spotted that until my lord asked this question in the Court of Appeal. But once you've seen it, it seems very obvious.
But my lord, we have to be careful what's actually under appeal here, because there is no doubt, and it is accepted, that the skilled person would work out the problems with the Ericsson function.
Well, as far as I can see, the evidence is the skilled person would work out all the problems with the Ericsson function, except the one pointed out by Lord Justice Nugee, which shows there's no point in even doing that, because there are actually much bigger problems with the Ericsson function.
But I mean,
which seems very odd.
It perhaps doesn't matter very much which problem they would alight on. I mean, there's lots of problems with it. And as I say, it's not subject to appeal now. The issue of whether or not they would spot the problems at all. I mean, it's accepted that they would spot the problems. That is an unchallenged part of the judgment.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, my lord, I'm not sure where it gets anyone.
Well, let's be clear. What's not challenged is the judge's finding that the skilled person would, first of all, do what Ericsson urged and verify whether the desired results were obtained, and find that they were not obtained, or realise that they were not obtained. So it's not challenged that they would check it and find out it didn't work. But that's as far as it goes at this stage. Of course, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's the point that's not being challenged.
Well, I think. Sorry, had my lord finished?
So, but what is challenged is what the skilled person does next.
Yes, indeed. But as I understand it, it's not being said that precisely what one notices about the problems with Ericsson impact on that.
Well, I think that is being said, as I understand it. That's hence the question. Because I think what is being said is, well, it's only in hindsight that you think, the problem here is with the KXL part, it's not with the mod C part, and therefore all I need to change is KXL.
Well, my lord, first of all, we need to be clear on what's not challenged, because what is not challenged is the whole section of the judgment starting at 208 to 220. And that includes, for example, so this is page 105 of the judgment, starting under the heading Assessment of the Ericsson function, all the way down to page 107, just before the heading What to do next. And so that includes, for example, in paragraph 215, which is on page 106, her acceptance that the lock step, this is at the bottom of that paragraph, her acceptance that the lockstep problem would be noticed by the skilled person was more equivocal than for C equals 16, but taking the expert evidence as a whole and allowing for the risk of hindsight, I readily conclude that it would be.
All right.
And my lord, just because my lord has raised the point about mod C again, we do have some pages of the transcript which I wasn't going to bore my lords with, but I fear I might now, or I ought to,
All right.
which relate to the evidence in the secondary evidence. And, sorry, getting ahead of myself.
Mm-hmm.
So what this is transcripts from the cross-examination of Ms. Dwyer, pages from the cross-examination of Ms. Dwyer, and it's where we're going through the secondary evidence. And on the first page, T199, we've got page 465, bottom right-hand corner. We're looking at a Samsung T-Doc, and I put the question at line 15, so what that means and what Samsung are saying is that their formula is still going to use the mod C, and you can see that that cross-examination goes over the page down to 466, line 6. Yes, so at the bottom of page 465, Ms. Dwyer accepts that the hashing function uses mod C, and they're proposing to use the exact same hashing function with a different key. And they're replacing kx plus L with a circ shift function. So they kept the mod C. And then if we look on T200, which
taking the words literally, I mean, the sense may be as you suggest, but literally that's not what the witness says. What the witness says at line 5 to 6 is they're going to take the X in the KX and L and replace it with a circ shift function.
Oh yes, that's right. Sorry, my lord. I think I misspoke. May have misspoken then. But they're keeping the mod C anyway.
Because the question you put was they would swap out the KXL, and she says no.
No, but the previous question was about keeping the mod C part of it.
Yeah, so the bottom of 465.
Yeah.
So 465, line 22, if you could answer this question, the function that they propose still uses mod C, does it not? And then on page T200, page 468, the bottom of that page, this is Qualcomm's proposed formula, and I put it line 24. So again, Qualcomm's proposed formula keeps the mod C, does it not? That is what they've chosen, yes. Then instead of KX plus L, they use a gold sequence, do they not? Yes. They explain just underneath the formula that we were looking at the bottom of that section that the gold code is a pseudo-random sequence. That is right. Gold codes are another type of pseudo-random number generator. They are pseudo-random sequences. Yes, so their proposal is using a different type of pseudo-random number generator together with the mod C function. Yes. So two other companies kept mod C, and certainly one of them replaced KX plus L with a random number generator. And my lords, I think I did refer, my lords, to paragraph 288. Well, I mean, 2881 was that the judge said that there were general trends that emerged, which was a fairly frequent reference to randomness as well as to hashing. Then when the judge looks at alternative routes at 292, subparagraph 3 of the judgment, he talks about Qualcomm used the well-known gold codes and Samsung used a cyclically shifted X. They're not necessarily against Apple's case because they retain mod C and support the overall approach of getting rid of the Ericsson function instead of tweaking it. The problem is, my lords, there are so many points in this case. That is why it is difficult on appeal to appreciate everything. I think, my Lord Justice Nugee
I did have a question. It was in the same area as my Lord Justice Birss. If you go to paragraph 212, little 1, Judge,
Yeah.
one of the points the Judge makes on the basis of Professor Lozano's evidence is the skilled person would realise the function would not work because of what's described as the, I think this is the lockstep problem. If you collide in one subframe, you're going to collide in the next subframe.
Yes.
And I think I understand how that works, the matter of distributive property of modular arithmetic. What I've not quite understood, the mod C in Ericsson, the C is not itself a figure, it's a calculation, it depends on the aggregation level.
Yes.
In the example where we have the diagram, C would always come out as 16, 8, 4 or 2.
Yes.
But I hadn't understood whether that's always true or whether there are other circumstances in which you get different values for C. Because if it is always the case, and if, as I think is now common ground, the C equals 16 problem is also a problem for 8, 4 and 2, then it would be a problem. You'd always get the same answer for every UE, whatever your inputs, which means you'd never get to the lockstep problem. Sorry, I may not have put that at all well.
C can vary, can be any number up to
Yes.
40 or something. Oh, sorry.
I was going to get there eventually. I just
So
wanted to check with my junior first.
The diagram we've got is, it just so happens the diagram we've got produces those round numbers.
Yes. Yes.
But they could be equally be
There could be something else.
completely other. Thank you. That explains the lockstep problem at little 1. Thank you.
I'm open to attempt to answer any other questions if my lords have any. Otherwise,
I think we're done. Thank you very much.
I'm grateful, my lords.
You can have a different number of CCEs in the PDCCH. In any subframe, you can have a different number of CCEs. So if you have 43 CCEs, then at aggregation level 1, C will be 43. Aggregation level 2, it'll be 21.
You take the integer.
Yeah, it's floor.
That's what the floor does.
Floor brackets, number of CCEs divided by the aggregation level. And
So at aggregation level 4, it would be 10.
At aggregation level 4, it would be 10, correct. And I think there was evidence that you could have C could be any number between 3 and 96. I think you could have 96 CCEs. So therefore, aggregation level 1, C would be 96. That's the most.
Yes, it's just that
I've
not quite understood, because one of the slides you showed us from Ericsson was a tree-based thing, and I thought that you then took us to the diagram. You said that's what this tree-based thing is, and so I think I made the mistake of thinking that was what it looked like in every subframe, but that's not the case.
No, my fault obviously, but I did say the number of CCEs could vary, and
Yes,
that's just an example where it's 32, makes it a pretty pattern. Who knows who came up with that. So, obviously these are points only where I think I can add something to what I said before, and they're responding to points in order they appeared in my learned friend's submission. In terms of dumbing down, I was always very careful to be accepting the judge's findings on that. That is why we don't challenge finding on step 1. At trial, we heavily attack the proposition that the skilled person without insight would see the particular flaws in question with the error zone. And that failed because the judge said, no, they're better than that. The only attribute that I relied on, or the only attributes, are based on findings of fact by the judge. 1, they never come across LCGs before. 2, they'd never created a random number generator of any sort. They never had to choose parameters for any random number generator.
Can I ask a very stupid question? The judge says the skilled person is a participant in round 1.
Yes.
He doesn't actually say what their academic or practical background are. They electrical engineers? What are they?
Yes. So they in his judgment he doesn't. There wasn't any dispute about that particular question. They would be electronics or telecommunications engineers. They would certainly have a degree, not necessarily a doctorate, and they would have some years of experience.
But they're not mathematicians and they're not computer programmers. They're electronics engineers.
They're working on specifying a mobile phone standard, so that's their job, and their qualifications are accordingly. There was a dispute about how wide they focused, whether they were to be regarded as working on this particular job or a broader focus, and the judge made the findings, and so that's not a dispute. They're around one person. So, my lords, my own friend made some submissions on the judgment. I just want to make a couple of comments on those. In terms of the number of steps involved, she took you to paragraph 294 of the judgment. And she said, this is really all there is to it for the specified claims. Obviously, to get the unspecified claims, you have to do more. Of course, this is missing the decision to use a random number generator. This goes straight from KX plus L needs a remedy. A literature search would throw up LCGs. There's obviously a crucial step between there, which is think, KX plus L, I want specifically a random number generator, which obviously is a major theme of my appeal, and here it's just missed out. Secondly, this is part of our complaint, this ignores what we call step 7, which is the question of having decided on an LCG, how do you scale the output of the LCG to a value between 0 and C minus 1? And of course the reason it does that is because you're banking mod C at an earlier stage, which is our complaint. It's just not realistic or fair or right or logical to bank mod C at an early stage. Now, on the topic of random number generators, my learned friend made a number of submissions about the conceptual differences and similarities between hashing functions and random number generators. And I won't go over that because I could tell your lordships at least understand my submission. But what she said at a number of points was words to the effect of, what matters is the question whether the skilled person would see that as a difference that matters. And of course, that question builds in hindsight, because the skilled person is only considering whether it's a difference that matters once they've made the leap from hashing functions. So the question is not whether having made the leap, they would think, this is something that puts us off. The question is whether they would regard one as substitutable for the other, as to which the answer is obvious.
It doesn't necessarily involve the hindsight, is it? I mean, it could. I understand that it could, but it doesn't have to be.
I mean, nothing has to be, but yes.
No, that's not right, if I may say so.
Oh, I've misunderstood your question then, I'm sorry.
To say that the only thing that matters is a distinction that matters, well, if the distinctions that matter are ones that are generated in hindsight, then it involves hindsight.
Right.
But there could be distinctions which are not generated with hindsight, they're generated with foresight, and they still matter. So I'm not fully with you, Mr. Abrams, that submission is as simple as you've made it sound.
I did misunderstand your question. Yes, all I was objecting to is the nature of the way she was putting the question. The question is whether, without hindsight, one would think, without any invention or insight or lateral thinking at all, I can take a random number generator and insert it into a hashing function and use it as the engine of my hashing function. that's the question, and that's a much fairer way of putting it, and really it answers itself simply because it's just a big conceptual leap that no one's ever taken before. Now, my learned friend attempted to deal with that. I think she said twice that there were cases where somebody had put a random number generator inside a hashing function. The first of those was Qualcomm, and in fact she showed you the cross-examination at the end. And what that showed is that a gold code is just a sequence. So if you multiply your key by the gold code, that gives you some randomness, and that's what was being said. She then said to the witness a long answer that included the word random number generator and got a yes. But the judge made a clear finding on this. He said at paragraph 292(3) that this is a self-contained function. So it's not a function that has a random number generator in the sense that we're talking about within it. It just takes this gold code and uses that effectively to hash the key. And that's what was being said in the exchange that my learned friend showed you in the cross-examination. The other thing that she put to you was in Nuth chapter 6. So that's the chapter on hashing. I think what she was saying, and hopefully forgive me if I've misquoted her, that on page, so in Nuth chapter 6, page 186 of the bundle, tab 18, page 186 of the bundle, I think she was saying that this is teaching you to use a random number generator within a hashing function. And if she was saying that, that's very surprising, because nobody ever suggested that that's what this was teaching at trial. And I asked Professor Lozano about that specifically. So I have shown you this, but because of the way that my learned friend put it, I ought to show you that it was specifically directed to this specific question. So that's tab 14, page 161. So at the bottom of page 215, I'm specifically referring to the sentence that my learned friend pointed you to. The middle squared method is not an especially good random number generator. So Professor Lozano's eyes are looking at the sentence in question. And I said, there is no suggestion in this chapter of Nuth or in chapter 3 of Nuth of using LCG or any other sort of recursive function within a hash function, is there? No. So that sentence clearly does not say use a random number generator within a hash function. It's just saying, look, you need to be careful because things that might appear to be good at generating randomness are not in fact good at generating randomness. That's all it's saying. It is definitely not saying use a random number generator within a hash function. If I could go back to the judgment in the core bundle tab 6. I'm sorry. Oh yes, sorry, paragraph 129, I do apologise. The last sentence of paragraph 129, again, my learned friend relied on it. The last sentence, Ms. Dwyer ultimately accepted that there was no practical problem so as to put the skilled person off from using an LCG merely because it was recursive. That's only relevant to the question once you've already decided to do an RNG inside your hashing function and it be an LCG. This really goes to the first point. Once you've thought of the idea of using an RNG, the fact that it's recursive wouldn't say, no, hang on, I can't do it. Then my learned friend took you a little bit later to paragraph 226. We're now in the context of what I call step 2, which is the decision to split the Ericsson function into its two parts, keep the mod C. And the first point she made on the evidence was to show that Ms. Dwyer said 226. So I think that if they were trying to keep it similar to the original format, that is true. And that assumes that they're trying to keep it to the similar format. It effectively assumes that that's meant to be proved. Now, in that context, my Lord Justice Birss put to my learned friend a proposition that there's no logic to the way it's dissected, except hindsight, because as in fact, all my lords have explained very clearly, KX plus L does not create randomization on its own. And it was discussed whether that was put to Professor Lozano. I think it might even been suggested it wasn't. And so the reference where I put to Professor Lozano that the only reason why you're dissecting it is hindsight is in the supplemental bundle, tab 2. Supplemental bundle, tab 14. It's pages 192 to 193 of the transcript. You have actually seen those pages. Bundle page 158, it's basically the left-hand side of 158, where I put to him very squarely that the only reason you're splitting it in that way, as described by him in his 206, is with hindsight. The question bridging pages 192 to 193.
As I read that, Mr. Abrams, you're clearly putting hindsight to him, which is at the bottom of 192.
Yes.
You say it is only because you are considering how to get from Ericsson to the patent that you're splitting it. What you don't do is put to him that the thing that he calls a randomization part isn't a randomization part.
I haven't. It's at that level of generality. My lord is correct. My learned friend then said, in the face of some questions from your lordships, well, it's not necessary to characterise the KX plus L part as the randomisation part. She said that wasn't necessary for her case to do it that way. And that's just simply not right as a matter of her case and the judge's judgment. It's an essential part of her case, and more importantly, perhaps, it's an essential part of the judge's judgment, because firstly, that was the case put and accepted. But the whole point is replacing a random number generator. Sorry, inserting a random number generator depends on seeing KX plus L, only that part, as being the randomization part, and thinking I need another sort of randomization to replace KX plus L and only KX plus L with. And you can see from the judgment, if you read 227 to 228, you can see how it's absolutely necessary to characterise the KX plus L part as the randomisation part for the judge's logic to work.
The professor did say it wasn't very good, for which you could substitute it was absolutely hopeless at producing random numbers. But that doesn't necessarily detract from his evidence that's what it's trying to do.
Indeed. He wasn't saying it was completely failing. He was saying that's the bit that's dealing with randomisation, and then the mod C is the squeeze.
What my lord has in mind is where he says not doing a good job at that, which I suggested might be a euphemism for failing.
Sure, but the true answer is the randomization comes from the function mod k, kx plus L mod C. That's the true answer. And he was not accepting that. He was saying kx plus L, that is the part that does randomization. And then the mod C has a separate and different function. And that's just wrong for the reasons which we've discussed.
Well, it is, I mean, what he could have been saying was this. We know what the mod C does. It's what he called squeezing down. But in the, take the case of C equals 16. I know it doesn't work for other reasons. But you want 16 possible outputs. You don't want more than that because you haven't got a 17 starting point. You don't want less than that because then you're not using all your 16 stuff. So doing the mod C does what you want it to do, which is produce 16 outputs. The problem is with the first part because it's not producing 16 different outputs when the interaction is not producing 16 different outputs.
Well, that is what he was saying.
That is what he was saying. But then when he says the first part is the randomization part, what he means is it's the kx plus L, which generates the numbers which you plug into the mod C, which you hope to have a uniform and random distribution outputs. You're not getting that, and that's because the bit that you're inputting, the kx plus L, doesn't do what it's meant to do. And I mean, if you read his evidence in that way, then he's not making what would be a fairly crude error of thinking that kx plus L produces random numbers.
No, but he would be making this error, which is to say, as he did, the mod C part, that's all fine. Because it is not simply kx plus L is problematic, mod C is fine. It is the use of modular arithmetic that is causing the problem. So on one view, you could say, well, kx plus L is producing a load of unique numbers. It's all the fault of mod C. That might be a caricature. Or you more realistically, you could say, it's the use of mod C together with kx plus L. They're both implicated in the problem. But what you can't say with any logic or consistency is mod C is fine, kx plus L needs to be changed. And so that's why his evidence, which he came up in the box, was just factually wrong, and the judge made a factual mistake in accepting that. And I mean, all I can do no better, I can do more than, but I can do no better than point to 212, which says the problem arises because of the distributive properties of modular arithmetic. And then straight away, then...
Sorry, when you say 212...
212 sub 1, third sentence.
Oh, right, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
212 sub 1, third sentence. The problem arises because of the distributive property of modular arithmetic. And although he doesn't say it in relation to C equals 16, the same is true.
But the problem with the C equals 16 problem is that when you look at the inputs to the kx plus L, because of the way it's constructed, it's always going to be of the form 16x plus y, so it's always going to produce the answer y. That's the problem. That's a problem with the kx plus L part, isn't it? I mean,
my lord, no.
The way you address this point was to say that the professor made a mistake in saying that the kx plus L was a randomization part, which seemed to be a semantic point, because then that enables you to say, well, you go off and look for an RNG. But if you get away from the semantic point and you say, what's the problem? What's the problem with the C equals 16 problem? It's the problem that the kx plus L produces an answer which is bound to be of the form 16x plus y, which is bound to produce the same answer for every input.
With respect, no. My focus is on the conclusion that the mod C part is fine and the kx plus L bit needs amending. I don't focus on saying that the kx plus L is a randomization part, but that is, I would suggest, part of the problem with Professor Lozano's analysis. But the real problem is Professor Lozano's statement, which the judge accepted, that the mod C is working fine, and you just can't say that. You could say it's all the mod C's fault. That would be a bit simplistic. You could say it's the relationship between kx plus L and mod C that's the problem, which is more realistic. But what you definitely can't say with any logic or sense is what the judge accepts, which is the mod C is fine, it's all in the KX plus L, and that's because if you just consider the KX plus L, it's producing you all the different numbers you need. They're all unique, and of course, that's the truth. It is the interaction of the both, and I think my learned friend accepted that at one stage. But it's certainly true, and so that's why step 2 is so hindsighty, because with hindsight you're saying, right, the solution to this is to change KX plus L, and just to go further, I showed your lordship's evidence yesterday that in terms of squeezing down, obviously mod C is one way to squeeze a large number down to a range between 0 and an integer. But there are lots of others. Professor Lozano said there are others. We looked at one in Nugee, page 114, and there are others. So you knowing that there are all these different methods, of which mod is one of them, and knowing that the problem is modular arithmetic, you can't possibly just simply say, as the professor did in the box, mod C is fine, it's that. Now, obviously, there are various ways you can go, and you may end up with a function which does include a mod C. A number of people, both LGE and we saw Samsung, my own friend just showed you, they did end up with a function that included mod C. But that doesn't mean that you can do this sort of analysis whereby you say mod C is fine, KX plus L is the randomization part, and just do it like that.
So as you know, sometimes patentees use hindsight. Less common, but not invariable. And I just wonder whether there's a bit of that going on, because I can see why it makes sense to say that a skilled person looking at Ericsson would understand that one of the purposes of the mod C was to make sure that you got an answer which was a number which was within C and not otherwise. And that seems pretty obvious, frankly, without any hindsight or anything. You can see that that's one of the things that's going on in the Ericsson function. Now, the point, with all the sophistication and effort that's gone into this appeal, is that we can sit here now and understand that there are more things going on, and in some ways what's wrong with that function is that mod C is doing two jobs, because it's interacting with KL plus X to make whatever it is. It's interacting with that other bit to make a random number, and it's also squeezing down. And the squeezing down bit is fine. It's the other bit that isn't working, but it's all in one function. And the trouble is, the kicker perhaps, is that if the skilled person sees that the mod C has a good reason to be there, which is to make sure that your answer is within C, then they're not going to be inclined to get rid of it, and they're not going to be inclined to look for it. There are other ways you could achieve it, but why should they bother?
That's, again, at the risk of sounding sycophantic, that's a very good point. And the reason why that way of looking at it helps me is because for their case to work, you have to decide that KX plus L is the randomization part and only the randomization part, because then you go, right, I can just solve all my problems by replacing the randomization part with another randomization. If you do what your lordship says, and I really can't see an answer to the point your lordship's putting to me, if you consider that the randomization is working in the way you say with all of it, then you're not going to be thinking, I can solve all my problems just by replacing the randomization part with another randomization part, because that isn't the randomization part. So to that extent, it is an important part of their case that KX plus L is labelled the randomization part, because only by labelling it the randomization part can you then say, I can solve the problem by this organ transplant. Mm-hmm.
That takes me to the question I wanted to ask, which is, I think you did refer us to the passage of cross-examination that the judge quotes at 224, but I'd like to see it again in context, if you wouldn't mind. So please, could you take us back to that, because at the moment I'm struggling to find it.
Yes. Yes. Anybody else? Yes. Yes.
Sub 14162. Thank you. 2216.
So supplemental bundle tab 14, page 162.
Page 216.
Sorry.
well, 162 of the bundle.
No, that can't be. That can't be right because that's Ms. Dwyer.
14.
224.
14.
Oh yes, sorry.
162 of the bundle.
Yep.
216 line 9 to 217 line 9.
And of course, this makes good the point that I was just discussing with my Lord Justice Birss, that this analysis, which is absolutely critical, requires the KX plus L to be regarded, and only the KX plus L, to be regarded as the randomisation part. And as my Lord explained better than I could, the randomisation is achieved by KX plus L mod C, the whole thing. My Lord, I was going to move on to the submissions on NRC3. Now, your Lordship asked me whether I put to the Professor, you just stop at using RAN 1. So let me show you the relevant cross-examination. It's in tab, or same tab that you're in, page 155 of the bundle. Page 108, starting at line 19, the Professor says, as will be explained, LCGs and MLCGs can still be useful only in carefully controlled situations. And I said, it makes clear that those carefully controlled situations are within a combined generator. Now, he doesn't disagree with that. He says something different. He says, well, the thrust of these sections is on generating extremely long sequences, as I explained yesterday. With periods, there are many, many orders of magnitude above what one will need for RAN 1. So anybody looking into solving the problem that we're discussing here would not be interested in this complicated generators. I think that should be these complicated generators. They would be looking for solutions such as the ones given in Nuth. So he's before I got to putting the point, he's saying, no, if you're a skilled person embarked on this task, you're not going to be interested in any combined generator. So there was no point in me saying to him at this stage, you'd use RAN, because his answer is no, but that's his answer, 108.238.23 to 109.5. So he's explaining why he says you wouldn't use RAN. What I did say is this, I'm on line 6 of page 109. So they might use what the book suggests are suitable for quick and dirty generator in that situation. And he says, effectively he says no, they would look to Nuth. So I'm putting to him, you would use an off-the-shelf solution from NRC3, quick and dirty generator, and he says no, they would look to Nuth, which is what the book recommends. Of course, it doesn't say that. And Nuth explains that LCGs is a very good solution for low complexity applications. So I was in the process of putting to him, you would use a combined generator if you read NRC3, and he rejected combined generators for reasons which I've addressed in great detail. I put to him specifically that you would use a quick and dirty generator as recommended by NRC3, and he said no. And that, in my learned friend misspoke. She said we didn't make the point in closing. In closing, we said, if they, the skilled person, did decide to embark on such a project, their lack of experience would direct them to an off-the-shelf LCG, which had been validated by an expert. We said they'd steer clear well of LCGs. They would either use RAN or another one from numerical recipes on C. And then we addressed what they would do if they were looking in NRC2. Obviously, that's not relevant given the judge's findings of fact. And I said if they were using Nuth, they would use the summary, because that pulls together the very complicated threads of Nuth's teaching and presents the reader with a way of selecting a simple, virtuous generator. Obviously, it was a major part of our case at trial that the skilled person who had got this far would use an off-the-shelf solution, probably not an LCG. If they were insistent on using LCG, they would use the off-the-shelf or easy recipe of Nuth paragraph 170. That links with a question put by my learned, by my lord, Lord Justice Birss, my Lord, you wondered whether Professor Lozano might have been infected in his reading of NRC 3. Our submission is that he was infected by NRC 2, and that what he was really considering was a skilled person whose thinking was based on NRC 2. And I gave you the evidence references yesterday. He was insistent that the skilled person he had in mind was a skilled person basing themselves on NRC 2 because his conception was they wouldn't have the latest copy of the book. And the judge dealt with that and rejected that as a matter of fact. So that's in, I gave you the references yesterday. It's Supplemental Bundle, tab 13, page 151. It's page 89, line 4 of the transcript to 90, line 10, the transcript where he said, no, skilled person would look at NRC 2. And so he was unquestionably infected with looking at that, and he was really giving his evidence based on that, and then that just led to somebody like that who's then put something contrary to them. They're going to say, no, I'm still right. I now come on to my learned friend's submission on the specified claims. And my learned friend dealt with the point, as she put it, that Knuth teaches that the modulus must be rather large. Please don't forget, I'm sure you won't, that Knuth and NRC 3 are more specific than just saying rather large. Knuth says at least 2 to the 30. That's page 170, internal page 170. And NRC says at least 2 to the power 64, which is alternatively 2 times 10 to the 19. And in that context, I'm sure your lordships will have picked this up, my learned friend took you to paragraph 216 of Professor Lozano, where he explains the bits of Knuth that he picks out to get to a modulus of D equals 65537. And you'll have seen that he nowhere there even addresses or takes on board Knuth's teaching that the modulus should be large, rather large, or at least 2 to the 30. In relation to step by step, my Lord Justice Birss asked me, did I put to the judge, make a specific submission that Professor Lozano only considered alternatives in cross-examination and hadn't considered alternatives in his report? As far as I can see, the answer to that question is no, I didn't make that specific point, that they'd come in that way. That was in the context of hashing and random number generators. Obviously, it was a major part of our case that it's unrealistic to look at random number generators, and it was literally paragraph 1 of our closing saying, if you're working on Ericsson and you're seeking to find something better, you'll be looking at hashing. But that specific point, the answer is no. Oh yes, you wanted to see the bit on the rest of the Wikipedia page of hashing. Usher. Sorry, excuse me. Usher. Sorry. So these are the pages in the SUP bundle. For some reason, we've only got the first in the SUP bundle, so this is the rest. And this is just to make good the point that if you looked up hash function, this is just to make good the point that if you looked up hash function in Wikipedia, the reference you get is to Knuth, volume 3. I mean, it's also...
So can you just point us to the reference?
Yes, so the reference is, it's on page 50. So this is from bundle C2, trial bundle, page 52, the final page, the printout. In the middle, there are references, and reference number 4 is to Knuth. That's a footnote to a sentence which you'll see on the second...
That's where the word hash comes from.
Yeah, the origins of the term hash.
Sorry, where is that?
Sorry. So if you've got, I'm using the numbers in red, which are the bundle numbers. So page 51, towards the bottom, says origins of the term.
Right.
the term hash, that's where footnote 4 appears. So that the first paragraph under the heading Origins of the Term has a footnote 4 at the end. And then if you go to the References section on bundle page 52, you'll see that reference number 4 is...
Well, I mean, the sentence starts with the word Nuth. Yeah.
Indeed. Indeed. And just to confirm everyone's prejudices, you see that this is a reference to the 1973 edition of Volume 3, whereas this printout is from 2007, by which case there was a 1998 volume. So it's, you know, Wikipedia is Wikipedia. And I think even when I think the current volume, the 98 volume of Nuth must have been published before Wikipedia even started, and yet this is to an out-of-date version of Wikipedia. I just make that point to underline the fact that you're not going to just be using Wikipedia alone. But if you do go to Wikipedia to look up hash functions, that's what you get. Are there any other questions that I can help your lordships with?
I think not. Thank you all for your helpful submissions on this tricky case. And you are to be congratulated on completing it in less than 2 days, which is appreciated. We will obviously be reserving our judgments to think about what the answer might be. They will be made available in the usual way once they have been produced in draft for corrections of typographical errors only. And that will be under embargo, and I think everybody now understands the seriousness of the embargo. The other purpose of that exercise, as you know, is to see if you can agree a draft order in the light of what we say in the judgment. If you can't agree a draft order, then short written submissions, please, and we will decide the order on paper.